I am happy to be here this morning in Oregon, and I'm really happy to be presenting to people in the same time zone. That makes life a lot easier. And I, as John said, am going to talk about teaching African American children to read, and particularly the impact of linguistic variation on the development of reading. Just a little about my own background. I am a speech language pathologist, and so my focus, my entire career has been on language. And in the beginning of my career, I was very interested in the impact of um, speech and language assessments on the overrepresentation of African American children in special education classrooms. And so when I started doing work in the schools and going in focused on assessment, it really became very clear that there was a significant reading problem among African American students in the schools. And I was really interested in the um, impact of language variation on the reading issues that we experience with African American children. And so that started me on this path. We've learned so much over the years, some things that surprised us, some that didn't, but certainly have developed a body of evidence that is moving us toward actually a focus on assessment, improving assessment, and also improving interventions for African American kids. So that's kind of where we are right now. So I like to start. My computer's moving a little slowly. I always like to start with shared assumptions. So our assumption is that reading is a language skill, and that you have to engage students linguistically in order for literacy to develop. Whenever I say this to people face to face, I get those duh kinds of looks, but the reality is that this is not something that we have known for a very long time. It's probably the last 25 or 30 years that we really started to build this focus on language and how it impacts reading. And in the late 1990s, there was a book called Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children that was edited by Catherine Snow and a colleague. And in that book, they said, reading is a language skill, and language professionals should be involved in the remediation of reading problems. And as a speech pathologist, I know that that's about the time then that it became part of the scope of practice for speech and language pathology. And before that, it wasn't. And so it really hasn't been that long, even though as a clinician, I knew that children who came to me clinically who were having difficulty with language also were struggling with reading. And so we know that reading and writing are essentially language on paper. And that's particularly true for children who are very young, that their language skills are really driving what happens with early reading. So oral language is a really important foundational skill for reading development. And as many of you know, I focus on children growing up in poverty primarily. African American children are disproportionately poor. So many of the children that we encounter in urban schools who are African American are also growing up in poverty. And so for those kids, we really have to think about what the variables are that may be the same or different than for kids who are not experiencing poverty. And so one of them is that literacy development, we know for all children begins long before they ever get to school. But for many children, it doesn't look conventional always. And so before they get to school, they've had some access to literacy, but not always in the ways that we expect or in the ways that we are comfortable building on when they get to school. And one of the major ways that we have talked about that is the idea of environmental literacy. And so for many of our children growing up in poverty, who are not being read to at home or who don't have a lot of books at home. Poverty is in the, or literacy for them is more in the environment that they're in. So when they see a red octagonal sign, they know that it's a stop sign. It says stop, that's literacy. When they see the golden arches, they know that's McDonald's. That's also a form of literacy. We called it environmental literacy. Now, when people talk about environmental literacy, they're talking about grass and stars and such. But what we mean is the literacy that is available in the environment that kids live in. They learn how to read signs, they learn how to recognize symbols, and that is the beginning of literacy. For us as teachers, it's not always clear how we build on that, and often we don't try to. But it's important to note because there's no such thing as a blank slate. When kids come to school, they know a lot. It's not always consistent with what we are teaching in school or what we expect them to know, but they do know a lot, and it's incumbent upon us to figure out what they know. What we know for sure, those have been our assumptions, and we actually know some of those things for sure. But what we definitely know about language and reading is that more than half of kids with language weakness or language impairments when they get to school will have problems with reading in the primary and secondary grades. So this was something that Hugh Katz talked about early on when we first started documenting the relationship between language impairments and reading, that more than half of kids who are experiencing any difficulty with language, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a clinical impairment, will have difficulty with reading development. And if these are unresolved, if they're unresolved by the time you get to second grade, kids, or fourth grade, kids are at higher risk for reading disabilities. And we know that this has been the case and is particularly true among our children who come from language minority backgrounds. Many immigrants, especially immigrants, refugees, and children from low-income families are particularly at high risk for lower academic achievement and low literacy levels. And for those of you who work with families growing up in poverty or who come from different linguistic backgrounds, you know that sometimes we're also dealing with low literacy levels of parents. So they're often not able to support their children in the ways that we expect and often value in schools, although I wish we were more accepting of the ways that those families do support their kids, because they do support their academic achievement. It's just not in the ways that we typically are looking for. So we're interested in this issue, I am, because of the poor reading outcomes for African-American kids. That's why we're focused on this population of students. So when we look at the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is often called the nation's report card, the 2019 NAEP showed that at fourth grade, the majority of African-American kids, and we say majority, we mean majority, 81%, that's more than 8 out of 10 kids are reading at a basic level or below in fourth grade. So they have not mastered early reading yet by the time African-American kids get to fourth grade. This means that fewer than 20% are actually proficient, and probably even fewer still are advanced. And so this is an alarming statistic, and it's particularly true for kids growing up in poverty. Although I like to say at this point, this is not just a poverty issue, because African-American children who are middle income are not reading at levels that we would expect for the resources that they have. There are a couple of studies that talk about the fact that African-American children who are middle income are reading at similar levels as white children who are low income. So this is not just a poverty issue, although we see it that it is more chronic and significant in children growing up in poverty. So when we talk about the achievement gap, one of our major concerns for African American children is that it's not closing. And it has been longstanding. We talk about it as being intractable because it's just not changing very much. And in fact, Peg Burchinal in 2011 in a study found that for every year that students, African American students were in school, the gap actually grows. The disparity or the difference between they and their middle income white and Asian peers, that gap seems to grow larger. And so the question is why? And today we're going to not focus on why there's a gap, because we can talk about a lot of issues. But one of the things we do know that's really obvious, I think is an obvious answer and may be simplified, is that we can see in our own data and in the data of the schools that we work with, that it's not that African American children aren't growing. They are growing. It's not fast enough. So there's this issue of acceleration of growth in reading, because we know that many of these students, and particularly low-income students, which is what Burchinal was talking about, come to school not having many of the basic skills that we expect children to have when they come to school. And so these are children who are starting out behind. And then as they stay in school and they're starting to catch up some, it's not happening fast enough and their peers aren't waiting for them. And so we see these children really growing in a really slow, incremental kind of way. And so they are here and their peers, they're growing and their peers are growing as well. And so what we see is growth in parallel instead of the gap closing. And so it just seems to get wider every year. And we've not made a significant dent in it in probably 30 years now. And yet, this is my soapbox, that I said at the beginning of this presentation that I originally got interested in these issues because of the overrepresentation of African American children on special education caseloads. And I figured because so many of them were qualified as speech and language impaired, that somehow we must be contributing to the problem as speech language pathologists. And so here we are, we fast forward probably 30 years and the pendulum has swung. And instead of seeing a significant overrepresentation, we're now seeing underrepresentation. And so how does that happen? Well, some of it is, the same thing we saw with the achievement gap, that in the beginning, when we were not disaggregating reading data, it looked like we were doing pretty well as a nation. But then teachers said, well, my class doesn't look like that. And so we started to disaggregate the data along a number of variables, race being one of them, gender, socioeconomic status, and we started to see a different picture. Well, one of the things that Paul Morgan and his colleagues at Penn State have done is taken the national data and disaggregated it. And what we find when we do that is that there is disproportionate underrepresentation in special education for African American and other minority students, but only in certain categories. So there are some categories that for which we see overrepresentation still. And there are categories like, disturbingly, behavior disorders, ORTIi, which is where ADHD is, and cognitive impairment. And some of this is about many things we could think about. Some of it is about racism. Some of it's about assessment, which is a completely different talk. But it's about the way we assess, the assessments that we use, and who we're identifying. But there's also some, from my own experience with children who are African American, and especially boys, going into IEPs, there are also some biases around what it is that we are observing with those kids. Is this really specific learning disability, but he also has ADD, so let's land on that. Well, ADD and specific learning disability are comorbid. So probably more than half of kids who have SLD also have ADHD. But with African American kids, we tend to choose that diagnosis over the SLD diagnosis, which really hurts children because they're not getting the educational interventions they need. So that's the kind of thing that Morgan et al. Found. And what we found was that in that category, speech and language impairment, where kids used to be, we used to think African American kids were overrepresented, they are now underrepresented. It's a huge pendulum swing. And the same is true for learning disabilities. So we see underrepresentation in these two major categories for the entire elementary and middle school time periods. And so why do we care? I think it's because these are categories for which we do have interventions and that we can identify interventions. That is not true for ADHD and some of the categories that we're more likely to see language minority children and African American children in. And there's a big movement in this country focused on dyslexia and specific learning disability. Kids who have dyslexia, the reading disability or difference depending on how you talk about it, and children who have math disabilities and writing disabilities. And then we look at the law, the IDEA. I say this everywhere I go now, the IDEA needs to be reauthorized. We need to be looking at the data and talking about revising some of the definitions. So in the IDEA, in the specific learning disabilities category, the exclusionary criteria are that you cannot be called SLD if you have learning problems that are primarily the result of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. So as a result, we do not tend to see children identified with dyslexia, math disabilities, or writing disabilities who are Black and brown and who are poor. So currently in the United States, we've decided that you can't be both poor and have LD. If you're poor and you can't read, we assume that you can't read because you're poor. That's not true. And what it ends up, and it doesn't even make sense, but what it ends up doing for kids is that we always talk about, like with dyslexia and math disabilities, that those kids need targeted interventions. If you are never identified and you do not get the diagnosis, then you don't get those interventions. So that is a concern going forward as we think about reading issues. Because if you think about 81% of the population of students who are African American in fourth grade struggling with reading, at least 10% of those children probably have reading disabilities that are undiagnosed and are being untreated. And so as we move forward, all these state laws that are developing, state bills focused on dyslexia, let's be mindful of not increasing the inequity between kids who are African American, Latino, and other children. And there is at Rutgers University, the dean of the School of Education, Wanda Blanchette, calls dyslexia the diagnosis of privilege for the privileged, because that's what it looks like in terms of who is diagnosed. So this is something I really like to talk about when I'm talking about African American kids and reading, because it continues to be part of the landscape when we're talking about who we're serving, who we're not serving, and why children aren't getting the intervention. There's the issue of classroom teaching, and then there's the issue of the interventions that children need to supplement classroom teaching, okay? So reading failure in African American children, as I said, is a long-standing, really high impact public health concern. We're not just talking about language and education anymore. We're talking about it as a public health concern. A lot of my research is funded by the National Institutes of Health, because reading failure is a public health concern. And if you think about what it means for someone in their life not to be a reader or not to be a functionally literate individual, it impacts your academic outcomes in the early years, your ability to pursue higher education. It influences the jobs you can take. Often individuals who are not uh, highly literate are in really low paying jobs. So it influences your ability to support your family, to be a homeowner, all of those things. So it's a cascade of difficulty that comes from reading failure, which is why it's considered a public health concern. But I want us to agree this morning that this is not about skills and abilities, and it's more about access and opportunity. So for African American kids, many of the reading concerns that we have are about access, access to interventions, access to quality reading instruction, and the opportunity to become strong readers. And so I want us to move away from sort of this deficit thinking that we've had in the past about these kids just don't have the ability. Oh, it's because they're poor. No, poverty is not malleable for us as teachers, but reading is. Reading is malleable, and so is language. And so I'm really interested in skills that we actually can influence. So this is just the same idea of health disparities. The Healthy People 2025, I think it is, or 2030 list now includes reading as a health disparity issue, and about reading at 4th grade as a health disparity issue. And a health disparity is a preventable difference. That's what I mean by malleable. Preventable difference in the burden of disease, injury, violence, or opportunity experienced by socially disadvantaged populations. So I want us to amend our thinking about these issues. So the point of this talk today is, what is the role of language in all of this? I'm going to talk about African American kids, and these are some areas that I'm going to hit on. So when we talk about language and language variation, I like to, again, start with a shared definition of what we're talking about. Whatever we're talking about, whether it's language or language variation, it's rule governed. Dialects are rule governed, languages are rule governed. Languages are rule governed symbol systems in which words are produced to represent actions, objects, and ideas. So if I say the word car, you get a mental representation of a car in your head. So the word car is used to represent the object car. And so it's a symbol system. There are finite combinations that you can use to generate new sentences or new words, or to express ideas in every language. And so, you know, one of the games that people are really into now is Wordle. And I'm sure there are some people out here who play it. And this third bullet, that there are finite combinations, is what allows you to be successful at that game. So even if I asked you explicitly, what letters can you combine in English to make words and which ones can't you? You might not be able to produce that list easily in an explicit way, but you do have implicit knowledge of these combinations. We all do. That's what allows us to play games like Wordle. So when you see that the first letter of the word in Wordle is F, you know that the next letter can't be Z, it can't be Q, it can't be a lot of different phonemes. And so you move on and start picking from the ones that are possible. That is your implicit knowledge of the combinations that are allowed in this language. And language is also an innate skill. It's something we talk about a lot as reading people, that when babies come into the world, they're wired for language. They are not wired for reading. Reading is a taught skill, but language is an innate skill. But language is also learned through members of the speech community to which you belong. So it may be an innate skill, but the same language doesn't develop for everybody. It depends on what speech community you're in. Language is verbal or nonverbal. Nonverbal language, of course, the most well-known example is American Sign Language. And the last bullet is, in addition, all the rest of these are important, but when we're talking about language variation, one of the most important ones is the last one. And that is that it's agreed upon by a community of speakers. So That's true for language overall. We agree in this country that English is the primary language of instruction, of media, of commerce. But within American English speakers, there are also language varieties that are agreed upon by those communities. And within those communities, dialects develop. And that's what we mean by language variation. It's another word for it. So a dialect is a language variety. It's used by different social, ethnic, or cultural groups. And so some examples are African-American English, which is used by many African-American people. When we talk about regional dialects, we're talking about Southern English, Northeastern English. Every region of the country in the United States has a different dialect. Typically, I use a dialect map, but I'm not doing that today. But every region of the country, of this country, has been split into dialect regions. And so regional dialects exist, but we also see them in communities, African-American communities. There's Chicano English, there's Hawaiian English. There are all kinds of Englishes in the country. And the one we're going to talk about today is African-American English. And what is African-American English? So look at the first bullet. Whenever we talk about language, the most important thing is it's systematic and rule governed. And it's a systematic rule governed variation of English, which is the definition of a dialect. It's not just the definition of African-American English. It's a dialect of American English. It's used by most, but not all African-Americans in the United States, which is important to note, because when you're working with especially young children and you hear differences in language use, every difference that you hear is not African-American English. Not all African-American people use it, but then also among children, you hear things that are developmental in nature, you hear things that are actually errors, and then there are things that are cultural. And so for teachers working with very young children, there's some distinctions to be made about what is contributing to the differences in language use that you hear. And also among African-American speakers, African-American English, we hear in low-income kids about 99% of the time. Low-income children will come to school using the language of their community, which is African-American English. Among middle-income kids, they are more likely to learn to code switch in their homes. And so sometimes you won't hear it as much because they know that school is a different kind of environment and that the language that they use at home and school are different. I learned this from my mother. I learned from listening to her talk on the phone mostly. And remember when the phone was on the wall and she would pick up the phone and I would stand and listen and try to guess who she was talking to by the way she was talking. So she was a minister of music at a church. So she would be talking to the pastor of the church and I would hear, oh yes, oh yes, oh, I will be ready and we will do that number on Sunday. And she was very formal and very intentional in her diction. Then she would hang up and somebody else would call and she'd pick it up and I'd hear, yeah, I don't know what he talked about. I think I'm just not going to be bothered with that. And I'm like, oh, that's Susie. And so I learned by listening to her. So implicitly what I was learning from that was you use language differently with different people. And then when we go to church, you'd hear it. And then you learn you use language differently in different spaces. And so for our middle income kids, many of them are getting the same kinds of experiences. For our low income students, many of them are more isolated and not moving in and out of their communities as much or engaging with people who are speaking across language systems. And so we see those students come to school and most of them will be using African-American English, but not all of our children will. African-American English, like most dialects, developed as an oral language and it has no written counterpart. And when I say that, I mean it's not codified for writing. It doesn't mean you won't see it in writing, because you will, but it really is an oral language system. And where will you see it in writing? Well, there are some authors, for example, like Zora Neale Hurston or Toni Morrison, who use dialect in their writing. But when you see it in writing, it's always in quotation marks. And so that's not written language, that's oral language on paper. And so even in those novels, the use of dialect is typically when someone is speaking. It's not the sentence leading up to the talk. And so that's still oral language. That's not a written form. In children, if you have a child in your classroom who pronounces with as with, they will spell it W-I-F. And if they are using habitual be, I be doing something, you will also see that in writing. So that's how we see language variation in writing. It is a manifestation of oral language on the page. And the final bullet is really, really important. And that is that African-American English is a low prestige dialect. And we talk about dialects as being high prestige and low prestige. And that turns out to be quite important. It's the way linguists talk about it. High prestige dialect is one where when you hear someone speak it, you think positive things or attribute positive characteristics to the speaker. Low prestige is the opposite. When you hear someone speak it, you attribute negative characteristics to the speaker. So when I'm presenting in person, I ask the audience to come up with examples of each one of these. So the high prestige variety that people come up with about 99% of the time is British English. When we hear a British accent, we think very positive things about the speaker. We love that accent and we think that therefore this person probably is high class, might be related to Queen Elizabeth or something. And that is a high prestige variety. Most of what we think about that speaker is positive. And within high prestige varieties, so like British English, there are low prestige varieties like Cockney English, which is spoken primarily in working class and low income communities. The high prestige variety that people talk about a lot in the United States is Bostonian English, and it's the Bostonian English of the Kennedys. So it's more the upper class and upper middle class variety of Bostonian English. It's not the one that we often hear in the urban areas. And then when we talk about low prestige varieties, without fail, except in Texas, people say Southern English is the low prestige variety in the United States. And then when I ask for people to talk about when you hear a Southern accent and your accent is part of your dialect, when you hear a Southern accent, what do you think about the speaker? And people say things like uneducated, redneck, all these like really negative adjectives. And so one of the things that's unfortunate when we talk about prestige as it relates to language, it is an example of conflating the person with their language system. And so we think your intelligence is impacted by, or your language variety, excuse me, reflects your intelligence, which is really unfair to speakers. And I have a very good friend who has a Southern accent, who has a PhD in statistics and is reticent to talk about around people because people think she's dumb just because of her accent. And so this idea of low prestige has real consequences, not only societally, but also educationally. So African-American English is a language variety that is considered low prestige, where when people hear teenagers speaking, especially boys, speaking African-American English, they think things like unmotivated, thug is one I hear a lot, just unfair characterizations based on language, but it's a real characterization. So if you can imagine what we're doing to adults and it's silencing them, imagine what it does to a 6-year-old. So what does it do to English? These are just examples of African-American English. It is not an exhaustive list, but it's the major characteristics and what they do to English. African-American English adds and deletes morphemes. And so you'll notice that this list of morphemes, I include these because every S is impacted. The possessive S, the plural S, and the third person singular S may be variably included. We call them zero, but they're not deleted all the time. It depends on the context, the physical context, the discourse context, and the communicative partner, whether you are including them or not. Past tense is often deleted. And one of the things about dialects is they are variably included. We call them zero, but they are variably included. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. And remember, it's rule governed. So there is some rule that's governing when they're included and when they're not. It transforms the main verb and verb phrase. The top two are the most common examples of African American English features, and you will hear them in both middle income and low income speakers. If someone is speaking African American English, they're usually doing these two things. So deletion of copula and auxiliary forms of the verb to be. Copula just means main verb. So, and of course we know auxiliary we called in school the helping verb. So the main verb is like is, he is hungry. And so in African American English, it can just be he hungry. And he is running fast becomes he running fast. And you see the final consonant is also deleted in the ing form. Subject verb agreement is also a really common feature, and it's usually was and were that are impacted. So a lot is going on. When we talk about verbs, you'll notice on this page, a lot of them have to do with the verb to be, which is transformed in African American English. Habitual be is one of my favorites. People recognize it when they hear it. It's the use of the unconjugated form of be, regardless of the subject. So he be, they be, she be, your dog be. You don't have to conjugate it, but it does not mean is. It does not mean he is getting some ice cream. He be getting some ice cream is about time. It's that habitual nature of the action. So whenever you hear be in its unconjugated form, you could put at the end of the sentence, all the time. He be getting some ice cream all the time. That's what it means. He is always getting ice cream. Or she be falling down the stairs. That means every time she gets close to the stairs, she falls. So it's the habitual nature that governs the use of be. Remote past been, I've been knowing how to swim. If you're from the South, you also know that this is part of the Southern English dialect. I've been knowing how to do something means I have known how to do that for a long time. So there are lots of different ways of marking time in African American English. Sometimes I talk about that. There are several different ways that you can mark time, and time is one of the areas that is really impacted by culture and cultural differences. Across culture, time is so different about what constitutes on time. And so that's reflected in the dialect. It also impacts phonology. I gave an example of the whiff for wit, that's the F for theta, the voiceless TH in the final position of words. If it's a voiced TH like bathe, then it's a V, not an F. And the voiceless TH can also be a T. So the final consonant in this case for the TH changes in African American English. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And then we see that same version, the voice TH in the initial position also changes and becomes a D in the pre-vocalic position. Dis, dem, dos, dat, day are all allowed. And then finally, consonant cluster reduction. Remember, this is not a complete list. We wrote an article actually a few years ago about phonological features of African American English, which you can find probably online. But consonant cluster reduction happens a lot. And so I talk about it all the time. And if you live in certain parts of the country, like in the South, where there is deletion of final consonants in the Southern dialect and in African American English, when you go to schools, there's not a final consonant in sight. So everybody's deleting that final consonant. And it has consequences actually when you're teaching phonemic awareness. It's something we wrote about a few years ago, that when we looked at kids in kindergarten, if you were trying to learn what they knew about phonemes, you really had to be careful which position of words you tested in. So if you assessed it in the final position in kindergarten, 50-50 chance of the kids getting it right because it's impacted by dialect. And so they're still working out how to represent that sound in the final position of words. But if you looked at their phoneme awareness in other positions of words, you would see that it's actually intact. But what we found was that if we looked at kindergartners and first graders, that the final consonant of words was, still really variable for kids in kindergarten, but by first grade, most kids had it. And so the impact of phonology when we're thinking about reading and we're thinking about assessment is not a small issue. The same is true for morphosyntax as well, that if it's impacted by dialect, it probably will take longer for kids to get a firm mental representation and be able to respond well on assessments or consistently on assessments. So cultural language differences, when we talk about African-American kids and other kids who speak things like Appalachian English, in addition to learning what we call academic English, they also need to learn the language of print and literacy, which is classroom English, in order to learn to read. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that. These kids we call bidialectal. We talk about bilingual kids a lot. We understand better, I think, across language differences. But when we talk about variation here, we're talking about within language variation. We do not understand it as well as teachers. We understand it in research, but we don't understand it as well as teachers and how to respond to it. But we do know that it really matters and puts kids at a disadvantage in learning environments if it's not taken into account. And so Antonou et al., who are in Cyprus, talk about giving consideration to thinking about these kids as dual language learners, because they are trying to manage two dialects. So they're dual dialect learners. They may be bidialectal or multidialectal, just like you can be bilingual and multilingual. So why does it matter? This is the mismatch hypothesis. I always point you to the year that it was first proposed, 1969, and we're still talking about this. This is almost 60 years later, that we are still looking at the mismatch hypothesis and talking about it and how does it matter. And this is the idea that during reading, the mismatch between your spoken language, which you learn at home, and the one that's used at school increases the cognitive load for students who speak dialects and makes it harder for them to get to text. So there's a cognitive burden that exists of trying to rectify in your system the relationship between the dialect that's in print and the one that you use in oral language. And so the mismatch hypothesis has been around for a while. We assumed that it was true, didn't necessarily know whether it was true. And then when I was at the University of Wisconsin, I worked with Mark Seidenberg, who does computational modeling, and asked him, he does a lot of things, but that was one of the major things that he's contributed. And I asked him whether we could build a computational model that proves or disproves the mismatch hypothesis once and for all. Is this really what's at play? Is it really a variable? It's not the only thing, but is this a significant issue? So we built a computational model where the spelling and the pronunciation either matched or didn't match. And so briefly, what we found was that if the spelling and the pronunciation matched in the model, that it took the model approximately 350 trials, 350 instances of practice to get to 75% mastery. But if the spelling and the pronunciation didn't match, it took the model more than 1,000 trials to get to 75% mastery. So we have always believed that this was what was happening to kids, and the model confirmed it, that if you are coming to reading or spelling in systems that don't match each other, it takes longer for you to bring these two systems together so that you are consistently producing the spelling or developing the reading necessary in this new system, which we refer to as General American English. Similar to bilingualism, it takes longer. But that said, remember I said everybody speaks a dialect, which means everybody on this call also speaks a dialect. And so how come we can all read? Well, it turns out it's not just the mismatch between classroom English and dialect that put you at risk. This is something we've known for a while, that the density of the dialect you speak, that is the magnitude of the difference between your oral system and the written system, really matter. But it wasn't until I moved to Georgia, because I'm in California now, but I just moved here last year. I was in Georgia at Georgia State University in Atlanta, and being in a region of the country where there's a major regional dialect and a major cultural dialect that are coming into contact with each other really helped us understand this dialect density issue better. That the kids who have higher dialect density are the ones who are more likely to be struggling with reading. So this is what dialect density is. We just developed this when I was at the University of Michigan many years ago. It's a method for quantifying dialect use. And it's just, if you have, for example, 100 utterance sample, what percentage of those utterances have dialect features in them? Okay, that's all dialect density is. So it's the number of total utterances divided by the number of features in each one of those utterances. So it's an index or degree of dialect used by speakers. That's what dialect density means. So you see, it's a continuum. And we've known that for a while, and now we understand the continuum better. So kids who are low on the continuum, where 10% or fewer of their utterances are impacted by dialect, are called low dialect users. And then at the other end are the high dialect users, for whom more than half of their utterances are impacted by dialect. So in the middle, of course, the moderate speakers, who actually tend to look more like the low speakers. In linguistics, they call this linguistic distance. It's just another way to talk about dialect density. So how far away is the child's language from the language of print? And it turns out that when people have looked at dialect density over the years, we know that it matters for spelling, it matters for reading, and it matters for writing. All these language-based literacy skills are impacted by how much dialect you speak. And I have a colleague at UCI who studies math, and it turns out that it also matters for mathematics, and particularly for word problems and instructions about how well you are able to parse them. Dialect density also matters there. So it's really a language skill that influences general language skills really significantly. So one of the important findings for us a couple of years ago was that the relationship between dialect density and reading is reciprocal. So the ability to read well is a strong predictor of whether you will be able to make this shift between African-American English and General American English that's so necessary to read, write, and spell. So if you're a good reader, you're better at this because, for one thing, you have more access to the language of print because you can actually read. So strong reading skill facilitates the ability to code switch between these systems. But kids who are high dialect users don't really have access to the print, is what we've been finding. These are the kids at greatest risk for reading problems. So kids with really high dialect density, it does decrease while you're in school, which was one of the things we were interested in. So if you go to school and you're using a lot of your community language, are you also learning the language of school, or do you just not have access to it? And what we found was that for every year that kids are in school, there's a linear decrease of about 5%. But if you started out at 80%, then a 5% increase is not enough. You're still a really dense dialect user. And those are the kids who are at greatest risk for reading problems. The kids for whom dialect density continues to be high throughout schooling. It matters for reading, but it also matters for language. So this is the syntactic processing subtest of the test of language development. So this is sentence comprehension. And so if you look at the horizontal axis, it's the DELV language variation. That's the diagnostic evaluation of language variation. It's a standardized test focused on kids who speak dialect. And one of the things that you can do with the DELF is you can quantify density. And so what we see is that the higher your density, the more you move toward 100 on this scale, the lower your scores are. There are fewer kids who are scoring in these high ranges on syntactic processing. Whereas if you look at the kids who speak less dialect, there are a lot more of them who are doing better with sentence comprehension. We see the same thing with reading across grades. So we see this same pattern where the kids who speak the highest dialect in first, second, third, fourth, and fifth grade are the ones who are most likely to be performing poorly. And this is the passage comprehension subtest of the Woodcock-Johnson. So they're having difficulty with reading comprehension the more dialect they use. And, there have been a lot of studies in the past. Does speaking dialect impact English comprehension? It doesn't really. Kids comprehend it, but what we wonder, and is something we are starting to look at, is whether it's a response time issue. It's not that you just don't comprehend, it takes you longer. And on our instruments, you get penalized for longer. And often you don't get that much time because it's a time test. If it's timed, the kids are more likely to do really poorly. And so some of the ways that we're assessing, we have to think about what it means for kids who have more to do cognitively in order to read a passage. So the ability to shift between African-American English and General American English is a strong predictor of early reading achievement. And you'll notice some of these say Standard American English because I haven't changed them, but we're not talking about it that way anymore. We don't want for us to be thinking about dialects or language as standard or non-standard, because the non-standard variety people think of as less than. The reality is that language variety occurs on a continuum, and there's General American English, which is the language of education, poverty, and commerce. And then on that continuum, there are lots of other Englishes. And so General American English is the preferred term. So I apologize for SAE continuing to be there, but that's what we were talking about at the time that these studies were written. So importantly, low dialect users do not show comparable patterns of reading and language risk. It's high dialect speakers who are having difficulty. Our high dialect users, we think, are so far away from the language of testing and reading that it negatively impacts their performance. And remember, this is within language variation. So we are not really surprised if the text is in English and you read Spanish only, that you are not performing well, because you need to be able to switch languages. But what we're finding is that even within language, if you are using a language variety that differs significantly from print, it's going to impact reading development. And mostly it slows kids down. It's not that they're not going to learn it, it's that this idea, this one size fits all idea, that we're going to teach this in first grade, this in second grade, and by third grade, everybody's going to be ready to make that switch to reading to learn. Not true. We are finding that that is not true. It's not true in third grade. It's not true by fourth grade. And so at some level for us as educators, as publishers, as curriculum developers, we really need to think about how many kids we're leaving behind by not accounting for the impact of language variability on the trajectory of reading development or the pace of reading development. But we know that learning the language of school is important. If you haven't learned it, we find by the end of second grade, if we don't see kids sort of moving or switching to the language of school by the end of second grade, they don't do so, many of them spontaneously. And so they're one or more grade levels behind in reading by the time they get to fourth or fifth grade. Hence the national data and what we see in schools. And so this is just an illustration of what we tend to see in terms of using dialect during reading. We use the Gray Oral Reading Test, where kids are reading General American English text. It's full of dialect. Most of the kids are using dialect, of course, while they're reading. When the passages are really easy, they can read them exactly as they're written, but as the vocabulary syntax gets harder, we see more dialect being used. And so the use of dialect in reading, our second graders were using a lot. And then by third grade, they dropped off. Fourth grade, a little more in fifth grade, but mostly we start to see this plateau around third grade. And that's what this is designed to show you, that they kind of plateau. How many kids is this? This is 2/3 of African-American English speakers who are using dialect during reading. And still in second grade, and then by the time we get to third and fourth grade, a third of kids are still using a lot of dialect. That's a lot of kids. And many of them won't make this shift given the way that we're currently teaching reading. So what should we do? We need to allow more time to learn the language of the classroom and learn more about the language that your students speak and how it's going to impact reading, teaching, and learning. How do you know? Well, you know that if you're teaching the some of the fricative sounds, that the fricatives are really impacted by dialect. Fricatives being S, T, F, V, and that's a place where we might need deeper teaching. We might need to slow down a bit. We might need to give kids more practice, more opportunity to negotiate that phonology, because we know that they are trying to develop a solid mental representation of these phonemes that differ significantly in their own language system. And so we have to build more time in. When I talk to teachers, that last bullet, when I talk to teachers, they're really proud of their reading blocks. Oh, we have an hour and a half reading block. And my question is always the same, but when do you read? So we need to build in more time to practice reading in the classroom. Give kids the opportunity to use the skills that you are teaching them. There's a lot of focus on getting rules, and there's very little focus on using those rules in a productive way in classrooms. That seems really important to do. And we need to value and respect the home language and how it differs from print. I've been talking a lot more recently about translanguaging, which some of you may know comes from bilingualism. And it's the idea that instead of suppressing dialect, because you notice I'm not really talking about teaching code switching, which is the direction a lot of people have gone in. And what that does is when kids come to school, we're saying, okay, that's your home language, that's wonderful, but you need to stop doing that and you need to learn this system. I do not disagree that kids need to learn the language of school, but how we get them there, I think, is really important. And so the idea of translanguaging is that we do not suppress the language that kids are experts in. They are experts in the language they bring to school. They know how to use it. They know the morphology, the phonology, the syntax, the pragmatics. And what we need to do is teach them the language of print that we need for them to have in order to read. And so we need to think about extending what they currently know to include what we need for them to know, instead of suppressing what they know and replacing it with what we need them to know. And it's not, I used to say it's a subtle difference. It's not that subtle. In this case, it requires us to do something different as the instructor, and allow that when you are learning a new language-based skill, you have to rely on your existing language skills to help you learn the new one. And if we are not allowing you to use your existing language skills, then we're impeding you learning the new one. And so we're moving toward thinking about how to integrate more translanguaging ideas into classrooms with African American speakers. And I'm going to make one more point, and then I'm going to stop so you can ask questions. Actually, I want to give an example, and I give this example a lot because it was so informative for me. The only thing missing was a camera. I was in South Africa in a rural area, and we were working with African Americans or African students, South African students who were 11 or 12 years old. They were middle school students, and we were working on using language in your village versus how you use language at school. And so they were giving speeches, and we were talking about how to be critical, how to do all these things that they are going to be able to do, going to need to be able to do when they get into a classroom in order to participate. And so we had this little activity where students memorized something, and they got up and they memorized it and then presented it using all the things we taught, like making eye contact, paying attention to your body language, scanning the room, all that kind of stuff. So it was a competition. And so this young lady, she was about 12, got up and she was going to do this speech from memory. And she stood there for a second, and then she looked at me and said, I need to do it in my language first, and then I can do it in English. So she did the whole speech in Sapedi, her local language, and the whole thing. And then she stopped and said, now I can do it in English. And I thought, oh my God, that was amazing. But what I learned from watching her was she needed this language that she has known from birth, that she has all these strength in, to do this task in a language that she can speak, but she's still learning it and she's not as strong in it. And once she was allowed to use it to support this skill, she rocked it. I mean, it was really good. And after that, the other kids said, can I do it in my language first? And so I watched them and I thought, you know, this is what we should be doing. We should be giving kids the opportunity to use their strength in language to build new skills and new strengths in language. And one of those is in reading and writing. And so that is my last example. And these are some of my collaborators over time who really contributed to a lot of our thinking in this work. And we can never forget our funders. Thank you to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and the National Institutes of Health. Okay, so now I'm ready to answer questions.
Yeah, so there's a couple questions here, and I'm actually, I wrote them down because they were kind of similar, and I want to make sure to get them. So I'm just going to share my screen here so you can kind of see the big ones that came up here. So the first one was, how would you go about scoring writing samples and writing subtests in standardized academic testing?
That's a good question. I have a lot of writing samples if anybody's interested in them. I collect them constantly, even though I don't know as much about writing. But one of the things that I am struck by when we think about writing is that when kids are learning how to spell, we allow them to do invented spelling. So we allow them to just write, because we want you to be able to just write without worrying about whether it's correct. I actually think that's important in writing samples as well, that if you really want to know what a child knows instead of what they can do structurally, then you just let them write and you score it for the ideas, and you go back and talk about the structure. And we saw an example of that with writing samples that students were writing from a prompt. It was from the test of written language, where they're writing from a prompt, a picture. And we had two kids, a boy and a girl in the same grade, writing about this picture. And the girl's sample was structurally perfect. But this is what it sounded like. This is a car. The car is green. The man is in the car. It was structurally perfect and devoid of any content, really, or anything that was creative at all. And if I were looking at it as a speech pathologist, I would think she had a language impairment because she's in 4th grade and she can only write simple sentences. Well, that's because she was focused on the structure. And then there was a boy who wrote about the same sample, and his first sentence was, "It's a whole lot of stuff going on in this picture." And then he went on and he just wrote and wrote and wrote with no regard for whether it was grammatically correct. He just got all these really great ideas down. It was a fantastic writing sample. But if we were scoring it the way the test of written language wants us to do, his really was bad because it had so much dialect in it. But that's not the goal of writing. The goal of writing is to get kids to learn how to write, to learn how to express their ideas in writing. And then our job as teachers is to scaffold them toward um, writing, you know, in a general American school kind of structure. And so when we think about standardized writing samples, I do not actually really believe in scoring adjustments because I think you can miss kids who are actually really having problems if you give them credit for things that you think are dialect, because the characteristics of language impairment and dialect actually overlap. And so I don't really actually believe in scoring adjustments on the sample, but I do believe in contextualizing the score outcome by talking about what the child did and being a little more holistic in the way that you interpret what the sample looks like, and the asterisks next to the score that says the score looks low, however, what we saw was X. And so I think some of that, what we know about as teachers and clinicians, has to come into play. We have to have some judgment about these things and not just allow the scores to drive who we see the kids as writers, because the child who is the best writer as a high dialect user is going to have a lot of dialect in their written samples.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate that answer too, because I was always taught like the score is important, but how they got that score is sometimes more important. We want to know like all the things that go into that. So
Yep.
Thank you. There's another question that actually just came in that I was thinking the same thing. So I'm going to ask this one. So what are your thoughts on timed oral reading fluency passages?
You know, again, you just got to know that if you do that, that African-American kids aren't going to do very well. Many of them, the high dialect users, I don't just want to say African-American, I'm really trying to make a distinction when we talk about language variety between the child whose use of dialect is going to impact language-based assessment. And one of the things that we saw with African-American kids in 3rd through 5th grade was that there was a trade-off between accuracy and rate. And so they really slowed down in order to try to read it accurately, which means they don't finish. And so, you know, there's this, and that's that cognitive load issue that I'm spending so many of my resources trying to be accurate that I can't afford the resources to do this. And so one of the things we saw in the GORT that was really informative was when you get to that penultimate passage where the test is getting ready to end, no attention paid to grammatical accuracy, full of dialect, and the focus instead is on this more complex syntax, the higher level vocabulary, and trying to get through the passage. And so we're asking kids to take their resources and split them in so many ways that when the test is timed, kids are really not, their outcomes aren't well, or their skills aren't well represented. I'm trying not to say this, but I spend a lot of time now talking about Chomsky's old language about competence versus performance. And when we time kids who are really high dialect users, all we see is how they perform. We know nothing about their competence because they weren't able to perform in the way that we expected on a test that's timed like that. And so we don't really get to see their competence. One of the things we're working on now is an assessment where we allow dialect responding, because unless the assessment is about code switching, what do you care whether they're using dialect or not? As long as they are able to get the gist and be able to answer the questions afterward. What we find with kids who are really constrained is they slow down and their score gets scored down for rate. They sometimes don't finish, and they don't get the gist because they don't get the meaning because they're too focused on the test. On the GORT, there was a passage about an eagle, and some poor kid, he was in like 4th grade, an African-American boy, he was reading the passage to me aloud, and every time he got to eagle, he said something else. And I thought, oh no, but I knew he wasn't monitoring it for comprehension either because he didn't notice. And he just kept reading, trying to get through the text. Then when I asked the questions and the first question was about an eagle, he said there was no eagle in that story. And I thought, oh God, that's what the passage was about, you know? So there has to be some, I know that our instruments are standardized and a lot of them are timed, and you might want to know what kids are doing with time, but again, your interpretation of what kids are doing has to include the fact that they spent so much of that time trying to hold on to the standard.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then time for one more question. Maybe this last question here, if you can read that on your screen there. It's kind of a long question, so I don't want to read it for you. But the last two kind of questions were about, writing in children's home language and dialects versus, general American English.
That's a good question. I think it depends on how old they are. I think when kids first come to school and they're trying to learn how to read, and you're all focused on standard academic English, and the child is trying to make a switch to a new language system at the same time that they're trying to learn something that we call rocket science, that's not fair. And it means that the kids aren't going to perform well. But once you get, kids are in school and you're thinking about, I think you should allow them to, that's what translanguaging is about, allow them to integrate their home language into their academic content. We're talking about that a lot in California because there are so many second language learners here, about the kinds of Englishes and whether the kids' ideas are clear, because what you're trying to get is clear ideas and get kids to express themselves. It's not really about whether it's AAE or general American English, but there's a tension between that and knowing that they have to learn the language of the classroom. And so I think we need to think about when it's important to focus on that and when it is a hindrance. And I think in the early years when kids are, just like we learned with invented spelling, in those early years when kids are learning how to write and they're learning how to read, I think we need to allow them to integrate their strongest language system into the learning. And then as they are learning, we focus on helping them transition toward the use of the general American English standard in text. And so it has to be learned, but it doesn't have to be careful about throwing out home languages when kids walk into the classroom because we're handicapping them.